Okay, hello everybody. I'm Forgotten. We're going to talk about interviewing today. I know there's no other talks about that today. Oh, wait, there's a couple. So what I'm going to focus on is a little bit different. Talking more about how to make good interview questions and kind of where a lot of the problems we have with a lot of the interviewing in InfoSec today. I've done a lot of interviews before InfoSec and even now in InfoSec, starting my own company, but I do a fair amount of interviewing for the technical interview portion. I've done about 50 now. I did about 400 before I started InfoSec, so quite a few. Also had some very odd training because one of the companies I used to work for got sued pretty often because of hiring practices. So they were really, really adamant about making sure that everybody was really particular about how they designed interviews. Some of these ideas people may not like, so just throwing that out there. Controversial ideas are fun. So kind of where we start, when people apply for a job, the first thing is HR typically gets a lot of resumes and they have to filter down to a smaller number because you can't interview everybody. So a lot of times what ends up happening is you get a simple filter of what HR knows. This is not always the best solution, but it's what the typical solution is today, is look for resumes and certifications. This is kind of where, especially in this area, given DoD 8570 and the requirements behind that of very specific certifications, there's a strong tinge towards that style of filtering, but it's not always the best way. Unfortunately, the technical industry hasn't really come up with a better standard for replacing that. So that's kind of what HR has to work with today. This is why a lot of times I tend to recommend to people going to events like this and talking to people about a job, because your resume going to someone technical and your discussion will take you miles further than submitting your resume online through the form that puts you into the mass pile, especially if you don't have a lot of degrees and certifications. When you're just getting started, this is more important than ever because, well, degrees and certifications, especially certifications, tend to be a little bit more expensive for getting started. Trying to avoid that bar for intro-level roles, and I'll definitely don't want to kill the budget trying to get certifications to get your first job. This is why I tend to recommend going to events like this and talking to people at the hiring areas upstairs and saying, hey, let's talk. Getting that internship in college or after where you get that opportunity to get some work experience is also a huge opportunity. The more experience you have, the better prepared you are. Schools focus on a lot of great theory that's very valuable, and so do certifications, but a lot of the practical ability that you learn on the job is miles different from what you will get in a classroom or in academia. It's how things work. I am a fan of performance-based evaluation, which is something that certifications and most academia doesn't do. Really, the only certification that I'm aware of that's popular at the moment is OSCP. OSCP is a very offense-focused cert that it's the only well-known performance-based assessment we have. I think in the next 5 years, we're going to start to see that change as some of the other organizations are starting to come out with their own, because we're seeing a problem where somebody gets a certification and they can't apply their skills. So a lot of the more technical side has seen this issue with candidates that have been hired. I think we're working more towards, in the training and certification fields, to have a much more performance-based evaluation, aka doing it rather than talking about it. It's starting to be viewed as much more valuable. So, the ideal interview. So personality fit in any team is obviously a huge component. If you can't work well with the other people in the team, that doesn't really work out. As much as for the interviewer to ask the interviewee, the other way around is also monstrously important. If you're going to get into a job and the culture of that team is not appropriate for you, it really probably isn't a good idea to work there. Probably the most extreme example for me was during an interview. I was tased with a 9-volt battery taser. They win. They will always win for the most bizarre and interesting interview ever for me. I didn't end up suing them, but, it was very inappropriate and very screwed up. For an InfoSec role, mind you, no physical security. Very bizarre company. That's when they realized they went too far. I would have figured way before that, but, that's a whole nother discussion. So a lot of the challenges that we have are around titles and descriptions is another whole component of fun, because cyber or information security, and then the second half is analyst, engineer, architect, specialist. You put them together, but you don't really get an idea of what they are, right? A lot of the job titles don't reflect what you're going to be doing. That's kind of important, because a security analyst, well, what does that mean, right? Is that a SOC analyst? Is that somebody who's looking at compliance data? I don't know. I can't tell from a job title. And this is another point where getting in touch with someone from a company and saying, okay, you have this job role, what does this mean? I talked to a SOC that actually had the tier 1 was engineers and the tier 2 was analysts. That's backwards to what I've seen everywhere else, but that one company had 700 people in their SOC for this MSSP. They clearly have their own way of doing things. Might have been the translation, because this was international, but what does engineer and analyst really mean is not necessarily appropriate with a job title. So I found that literally finding someone who I know through conferences, through meetups, and saying, okay, what is this job about? What are you looking for? Is always a better choice for me to find out what that job really is. Because I'm particular about what I want to do. And I think most people know kind of what you want, if something's good for you. If you're into programming, and this job is not at all programming and it's something else, can you tell from the job description? Sometimes, sometimes not. Sometimes people say we need a person for this team, and the job description that comes out doesn't at all match that. It's a generic one that someone found on the internet. So trying to find that match and understanding the right role is very, very important. This becomes increasingly important when you first get started because, well, what do you want to do when you get started? That's a question I ask every single intro candidate, and pretty much all of them say, I want to do security. I'm like, okay, well, there's a lot of areas, right? Forensics is very different from SOC analysis, is very different from reverse engineering, is very different from pen testing. All of these different fields, people have started directly in them. People have gotten to them through other roles. So understanding where your skills are, where your interests are is very important. If you're not analytical in nature, the SOC is kind of going to be a tough world, right? If you don't like to look at data, and if logs are boring, well, catching the bad guy, that's not driving to you, you're going to be very frustrated in the SOC, because that's the dream. That's the best part of the SOC, is actually catching the bad guy. If that doesn't excite you, it's going to be a tough time. Passion for the field. So this is something that is very difficult to measure, but very important. A lot of people have told me, and I personally feel like this is probably one of the most important components. A lot of the security world is not really a 40-hour job. Most of the people who are very successful are spending time out of work hours to do things like this, to go to meetups, to participate in the community and learn. In that 9 to 5, how many people really have time to really go learn and do new things that aren't appropriate for their job role? Very rarely. Career development in a lot of organizations takes place outside of the workplace. So you have to budget in that time if you want to progress. If you want to stay in the SOC or stay in your intro role, not necessarily the same thing, by the way, then you got to have passion. You got to make the time to go out and learn that skill set to advance to the next role. And how do you do that is complicated. There's not a clear path to any role into or in security. There is no how do I get a job in the SOC is a common question. There's not really a straight path. There's not a right or wrong answer. Knowing the tools is a great start. That's generally where I recommend. Surprising number of people get into the SOC world without that skill set. It's definitely possible. But it's a hard path. Same thing with pen testing. Getting started is the number one challenge. Getting that first opportunity in the role you want. Someone's got to give you a chance, and you got to convince them to give you a chance. A lot of that comes from you going out and doing everything you can. So an example, I went through, when I first started, I was interested in getting into pen testing, and I started researching everything I could. I found a lot of great information. I also found out that about 60% of pen testing is report writing. Not something I initially thought of, and not something that, I started to second guess myself. Do I really want to go down this path if 60% of my time is spent writing reports that a lot of times may not be actionable, may not be something someone takes and says, I'm going to go fix all this. It's going to be like, all right, the top 10% will fix, what do we need to get the checkbox? So I also dreamed of, okay, I want to change things. I want to actually make an impact in this industry. So to do that, I have to be at the top, say, 5% of whatever I'm doing. The pen testing world has an amazing volume of very, very strong and dedicated people that are there. You're going to have trouble getting into that top percentage beyond the difficulty of getting that first opportunity. The SOC world, on the other hand, actually the bar is much lower. There's not much information. It's very hard to learn more of the advanced skills, but with persistence you can. And the bar to get to that top tier is actually not as high as most people would think. But you have to love that analytical world. You have to love that challenge. This is where I say passion for the specific work that you're trying to get into. If you don't love it, if you're not driven to go research and learn more, right? Maybe this isn't the right fit, right? If a lot of people think about reverse engineering and think it's sexy, and then they look at assembly for the first time, say, oh, damn, that's tough. It can be. Depends on what your goals are. If you have that background, if you have that experience, if you enjoy that challenge of taking things apart and understanding how code works, maybe that is. Take the opportunity. There's an amazing volume of free online available training. Take a look. See how it works. See if you like it. BSides are starting to do reverse engineering training and have been for a couple years. Take a class. See whether you like it. Go play with some of the open source tools. Play a CTF. Capture the flag challenges are freely available. It's not like it was 20 years ago where you kind of have to sketch, is this breaking the law? To kind of play with stuff and really learn. Now you have that opportunity through various challenges that people have created to drive interest. Puzzles. I love them. Some people don't. I'm a gamer. It's a thing. I actually stopped playing most online games when I found CTFs because that was my new online game. So a different way of thinking about things. Also, I tend to learn best by doing. Here's just a theme. I've noticed a lot of people in this industry the theory is helpful, but when I actually go do it, I feel like I know it way better. And challenges give us that opportunity. And also, a lot of companies are starting to recognize that that's a good measure of performance. CTFs, hey, if you do well, maybe you get a job. I don't know, it happens. Remember 5 years ago, Raytheon did something on one of their facilities. It's the first time I had ever seen literally, hey, if you do good, we might hire you if you're clearable. That was probably the first one. It was about 6 years ago. This is starting to catch on and become a lot more popular today. So, some common questions. What runs on port XYZ? For example, what runs on port 993 was an interview question I got. Does anyone know offhand? Any email admins in the room? There you go. We got one person somewhere. Couldn't tell exactly where that came from, but how many jobs is that knowledge being on hand applicable to? If you're an email admin, fair. If you're a SOC analyst, maybe. But I can Google that in 2 seconds. Is that really a valuable measure of a candidate's appropriateness for any particular job? Not really. What port does ping run on? This one's a fun one. This is when you can tell they're messing with you. Port doesn't run, or ping doesn't run on a port most of the time. There's one edge case where it does, but that's not the point. Understanding protocols, yes, okay, but is there a job where knowing that has a lot of value? Networking, but really not necessarily in security. It's kind of a gotcha question. Describe what happens when you type www.google.com. This is probably the most appropriate one that I've heard of that I hate for the SOC. Someone wrote a 40-page response on GitHub. From every keystroke, what happens? I joked with one of my former coworkers that she should add the neuroscience piece, because while you're being ridiculous, why not just take it all the way the next level? The point being understanding DNS and how web requests work, that actually has value to certain jobs, but it's used in jobs where it has no value. And then, if you encrypt and compress a file, which do you do first and why? A very interesting question. If you know about encryption and compression, it's very good to prove your knowledge and understanding of it, except if you've Googled it because you've been asked it before and it irritated you because it's a stupid question. Is it appropriate for most of the roles that you're interviewing for? Unless you're building tools where you're doing both, probably not. That's a pretty edge case. So, not really. These common questions, most of them aren't really appropriate to what you're going to be doing. In any interview, why are we not sticking someone on a keyboard? Here's a challenge. Play with it. Sometimes this can backfire. There was a example on Twitter where an intern was given a problem and they ended up asking on Twitter for help, which is really funny because they tagged the company that actually gave them the challenge in the request to, it was a reversing challenge. They asked Malware Unicorn, hey, can you help me solve this? The company's like, don't worry about it. You're no longer in the running because this is not an appropriate thing. Cheating, well, is it cheating? I don't know. But the point being, they had to make a new challenge because the candidate released it on the internet. Now everybody knew what their challenge was. Okay, that kind of sucked, but realistically, this was a reasonable way to evaluate, is this person capable of doing what we need them to do? There's an ethical question of, you can't give them real work. You can't ask them to do something that you actually will go market, but a similar case, for example, a mock case that you've made for training, certainly would be appropriate to have a candidate do to prove their knowledge and skill. This is something that we're not really seeing much of yet, but I'm hoping in the next few years we start to see more performance-based evaluation in interviewing, because the idea of asking a question to determine your knowledge isn't really evaluating, can you do this job? Can you be successful in this role? And that's really what we're trying to do, but questions kind of fall short in a lot of cases on actual testing of ability. Some concerns, the 9-volt battery taser certainly was a challenge and inappropriate. So when I first went through that lovely interview training years and years ago, they talked about these protected classes where federally they've said you can't discriminate based on these things. Age, age was funny because they could discriminate if you're too young but not too old. Interesting note on that one. Kind of odd, but whatever. So now they've increased the number of protected classes. At the time there were 7. I think there's 14 on that list. The company I worked for at the time had 127, including favorite football team. They were a little extreme. Can't discriminate hiring based on football team. If that's a question, there's a question, why are you interviewing? But so a lot of what I've found valuable, given you can't necessarily create a challenge for every job role if it's a one-off where you're hiring one person for a role versus SOC analyst, you may have 10 people for that role. One-offs are a little harder. So I created scenarios that were realistic from work. This was especially valuable for new candidates who may not have background. Here's a scenario of 20 things that are broken. What would you do? Where's your knowledge? So an example of this, the CEO emails to your boss a computer with no antivirus, wants you to go fix it. You show up, you find it's the computer that facilities installed without telling IT. It's on the network, not the domain. All the boilers, air handlers, and chillers for the distribution centers that are actively in operation are plugged into this thing and controlled by it. Facilities uses it on a daily basis to monitor and control those assets. And it's just chilling on the corporate network. It can access the internet. It's not password protected because they need to constantly be able to monitor the boilers and chillers and air handlers and all that fun stuff. It's in the middle of the warehouse in an unlocked room because the facilities manager goes in and out. It's got no authentication. It's in Windows Vista, not approved by anybody. It's just something. The software CD is from 1989. Like, what do you do? Oh yeah, I forgot to mention the hard-coded credential for the backup script that's sitting on the desktop in PowerShell using SA, which is MS SQL's master, basically, root for the database. Full control of all the things. Okay, now what would you fix? Well, there's 50 things you could fix and a lot of different ways you can do it. Is there a right answer? Not necessarily, but what you do to respond to that tells me what your background is, where your skills lie. I made about 10 scenarios like that. There's no right answer, but going through those and saying, what is your experience? What is your knowledge? Where does your head tell you I should look into that first? It's a good spot. Also tells me a little bit about maturity. If your answer is rip it out, that's probably not going to work because in the real world, that's going to happen. And you can't impact operations. They have to be able to manage those boilers and chillers. Shut them down if needed. What if there's an emergency? Plan that changeover where you're adding a new machine or whatever. What does the vendor say? How much of those issues can we fix? All those hard-coded passwords, I think there were 13 in total. Half of them we could change, half of them we couldn't. Well, what can we do, right? So, ironically, when I did a series of interviews, my boss, without talking to me, literally told me, okay, I know that candidate was good. I'm like, how'd you know? He says, well, if they're there a short time, they didn't do well. Really? Yeah, if you answer to that whole scenario question, if your answer is 30 seconds, you probably don't have a strong background. If you go on for 10 minutes about all the different ways and ideas that you have on how to fix that, it's a reasonable thing because there's so many problems in that scenario that a short interview tells me you didn't have any ideas, right? So it actually became time-based, which was really funny. So assessing learning, again, that practical assessment, CTF-based hiring, so actually having a CTF based on the skills you need and saying, okay, we need SOC analysts. Here's a bunch of simulated cases that we made up and created the artifacts for. The people who do well on them, let's talk to them about a job. Practical role-related tasks, again, having that idea of, here's a task similar, let's see how you do. No certification is really telling me how you react to a scenario in the SOC. I need to see you do a task and report on it. Tell me what you did. Tell me what you found. Even if you didn't find anything, if you had a reasonable way of assessing it, maybe that's good, right? Maybe you're appropriate for a junior role. That analysis and the way that you think about that challenge, the way you approach it, tells me what you know. The open-ended scenarios I mentioned are also a lot of fun. So, again, I'm very focused on this performance-based assessment because that's not what I'm seeing. And I feel like that's how we need to assess candidates today. This is a very big shift from what we've seen in the past, but probably more appropriate to doctors, for example, do residencies when they start. Trade skills do I forget the name, it's not mentorship, but they have basically where they start journeyman apprentice modelship, or journeyman apprentice model, where you literally have a master and a newbie following them learning the trade. I think that's kind of where things are going. A lot of where things are moving, because this is very much an applied skill. The theory doesn't teach you enough to be able to solve the problems of the work. And also the fun challenge of, can you learn? And I say that because this industry changes at a pace where training on a particular task, you're not going to get training on everything you need to do. You're going to have to be able to Google and figure it out. Or Bing, DuckDuckGo, whatever your choice of engine is. But if you can't do the research, if you can't find the answer, this field is going to be tough. That's the other component of where things are going. So, now that I've talked a few minutes, questions, comments, concerns, squirrels? No? Yes, sir.
OSCP is for routine red team and case. Do you think in the future you're going to work get that to get a switcher to get that start to get IR that's actually like interactive?
So, compared to OSCP as red team, an IR-based performance assessment certification, I think that's the way things are going to go. I really hope someone makes it. If not, I'm afraid I might have to poke my head into that space. Not really where I want to go, but it might end up happening. Probably more in the SOC space for what I'm doing right now. But I think that's kind of where things are moving. So I think I'm running out of time. If you have more questions, I'm happy to talk more. Come visit me upstairs in the hallway. Happy to talk to anybody. Thank you.